This is Humble Mind, a social learning community with an insatiable zest for new ideas and connecting with like minds in life and in business. This podcast is where we get to speak with other unusual humble minds. And if you're a member of our community, you get to join our podcast recording live, as well as early access to releases of new episodes, clips in our platform, our weekly newsletter, the ability to connect with the rest of our members, and our community courses, all of which are available on Humble Mind once you become a member. You also get an invitation to our Thursday Thrive Live group meetup session as well. So check out humblemind.co for more. How often do you think about the future? How do you think about the future? Are you thinking clearly about it? Do you feel optimistic, upbeat, or pessimistic, apathetic? Learning how to think and to think clearly about what's headed our way, especially when it hasn't come to pass yet, and how to best plan, to react, and to capitalize on it is a unique and core human ability. Today we're speaking with John Cherry, a brand strategist and a futurist who has quite a lot to say on the topic. And when it comes to learning how to think clearly, especially when we try and think clearly about what's coming in the future, you'll find that this conversation was really an amazing treat for the ears and for the brain, because we spoke about everything from learning how to work with assumptions to giving yourself a model and a process on how to think, literally to think about thinking, as well as where and how to put that into practice and how to practice that muscle in terms of decision making and having that show up, having your clear thinking show up in the results and the outcomes that you're wanting to happen. I think you'll enjoy the conversation as much as I did and the rest of our members did. Here it comes. Today, we're speaking to John, who I'm lucky enough to speak to, because every time I speak to him, I feel a little bit smarter. So, John, welcome back again to the podcast. Nice to have you with us.
Thanks, Alex. I always feel like you're a bit of a praise singer for me. You know, those people that move ahead of someone great, and they say such nice things. So thanks. It's always a pleasure to be on your show.
I'm throwing the roses and the petals at your feet.
I love it.
So the topic that I chose was about, the future of thinking clearly, and perhaps those are in a way two different topics, and maybe we can approach them separately in a way today as well. And something that I wrote about on the Humble Mind community earlier this week was just thinking and how to think clearly. And I've been reading a book, as I said earlier, by Shane Parrish called Clear Thinking, which has been, just a wonderful way of just sort of zooming out and looking at your mental modeling and your thinking and the way you make judgments in a really healthy way. And so I want to start there. How would you, as a futurist, as a strategist, as someone who is, paid to think essentially by other organizations and businesses, how do you think?
Yeah, so I think that's such a great place to start if we're talking about futures thinking or strategic thinking or thinking clearly. It's always useful to actually just start off by thinking about thinking. And that's, I know philosophy, the definition of philosophy is thinking about thinking. It is the practice of really analyzing how you think. And for me, this is quite an interesting topic because a couple of years ago, I read the book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. And it was a pretty intense book to read, I must be honest. I mean, at the time I was studying, so I guess I was in that frame where I could absorb quite complex information. So I really enjoyed it. But if I have to try and summarize Kahneman's thesis in the book, he says that essentially there are two systems of thinking. System one thinking, which is very intuitive, it's reactionary, it tends to be the kind of thinking that we do every single day, which is almost unconscious non-thinking. It's where our brain understands the situation as a pattern which is familiar, and there's obviously a response to that pattern which because we've used it before, it's kind of a safe response. So systems one or system one thinking is prevalent everywhere. And in many ways, I kind of feel that as technology improves, we outsource more and more of our thinking to this system one type thinking, because thinking itself is very difficult. It takes a lot of energy. You really have to concentrate if you're thinking clearly or thinking carefully. So it's much easier for us to outsource our thinking to an expert that we find online. Or nowadays we outsource our thinking to AI. We just put in a prompt into ChatGPT and voila, there's the thinking done for us. So there is this system one thinking, which, as what I'd like to call it, it's unconscious thinking. Opposed to that, or maybe instead of opposed to, maybe at a deeper level, there is what he termed systems two thinking. And this is very considered. It's analytical. It's logical. It's where you take a problem and you really try and unpack that problem. And spend a lot of time, mental effort, in going through that problem and really trying to figure out what's going on here and how might we solve that problem. So as I said before, that takes a lot of work. And in many ways, it's work which you also need to practice, because it's not something that I think comes easily. It's a style of thinking where you've really got to get into it. And as I was saying, at the time I was thinking in a very specific way when I read that book, because when you go and study, you have to be able to turn on a part of your brain where you're scanning very complex information and trying to pick out like valuable understanding from that information. It's a practice. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. And I really feel my argument is, working with clients and just looking at how the world develops, is that this system two thinking is becoming rarer and rarer. And that's a huge problem, because in many ways, if you think about it really carefully, if you are outsourcing your thinking, what you're doing is you're basing your decisions, your decision making and your judgment forming on information. So you're using as base building blocks of your thinking information that's not necessarily yours. And that thinking that you've accepted as truth might not be truth. It might be someone's opinion who's just very convincing in the way that they've presented it to you. So what happens then is that your decision making becomes more and more problematic. And that can have fairly significant consequences if you're just not aware of that. So we, in many parts of this work, we talk about bias, we talk about assumptions, and clear thinking is really looking at those assumptions and those biases and saying, first of all, are they true? Are they based on fact? And actually, are they helpful in the judgments that we are creating from that information? Is that helpful in what we're trying to achieve? I suppose the more we talk about it, and the more you think about the act of thinking and what an empowering tool that really is, if you're good at it and you know how to do it properly, you really do get a sense of confidence from your ability in doing that. Because now you're not at the mercy of, I suppose, what's out there. You can think for yourself. You can reason for yourself. You can solve problems on your own without having to outsource that to somebody else. Starting point, I think that's potentially quite useful in just understanding those different forms of thinking and how potentially that one form is not as prolific potentially as what it should be.
Yeah, I suppose it's worthwhile thinking about it like a muscle in a way, right? It's something that benefits from a type of an exercise and going over certain types of principles or models that help you to become a better thinker. And how do we know when you think better? Well, I suppose you can infer that from the decisions that are made or the judgments that are made, right? So that over time, I think this is also something from Daniel Kahneman's book, which I love as well, which is that to become a better decision maker, you've got to look at the progress over time, over many decisions. So you don't just suddenly start making amazing decisions from tomorrow morning, right? It doesn't happen like that. It's over time, and the model tends towards more successful outcomes over time, right? So that's perhaps also, I think, another element of being able to see someone who is a considered thinker, someone who can see further out rather than only in the present, right? Because we're so used to doing that type 1 thinking, which you just said, which is that like, it's right now, in the here and now, what am I going to do? What are the basic responses that I'm like, fight or flight? Am I hungry? The kind of caveman way of thinking.
Right.
So we've got to be able to get better at sort of visualizing what isn't there in a way. And I suppose that's a big part of it, right?
Right. So that's a perfect segue into futures thinking. So if we are now wanting to make decisions where we are wanting to have a preferable outcome in the future. Now, now that we've unpacked thinking, let's unpack the future. Now, the future is not a place where we have any facts. No matter what someone will say to you, you can't predict the future. No one knows what's going to happen in the future. So if you are now in a position where you say, right, I have a business, I want this business to be successful. In order for it to be successful, I have limited resources. I have limited money. I don't have a vast amount of time. My judgment and my decision-making as to where to apply my focus and where to spend my money needs to be very, very accurate. And whatever decisions you make now will bear fruit in the future. So in many ways, you need to be able to at least make a judgment on how the future might unfold. Now, you can attempt to predict what the future will look like, but 9 times out of 10, you're going to be wrong. Because the future is complex, and there are so many different factors which influence the future. And if you predict something and you put all of your money into one specific future, hoping that this future will manifest, you might be lucky once or twice, but on the 3rd round of you going all in, you're going to get wiped out. So it's not a very good strategy. So when thinking about the future, that's where critical thinking really, really comes in. And what you need to do is not listen to sort of some guru who will tell you, Bitcoin is the new currency. Put all your money in Bitcoin.
Woo, Bitcoin.
As you know, that's my favorite. You've got to say to yourself, right, how do I critically look at different futures that might unfold? What factors are actually influencing the future today? Are those factors significant? So will this thing have a huge impact on my business or on me or on the economy in which I operate? And how might that roll out? How might it play out into the future? Because it could go in many different directions. So that's why futurists like to do scenario planning, where, you put 4 little stories into 4 neat boxes and you go, right, best case scenario, worst case scenario, imagine if, and I'm pretty sure that this thing is going to happen. As you go through the process of thinking of those various scenarios, I think what's useful is that you can kind of see, wow, actually, it's pretty plausible that some of the factors that are at play now in the present might actually lead us all in a direction which would not be great. It's possible that the conditions under which we'll do business in the future might be terrible. So you think about climate change. Wow. So just for a second, imagine if the scientists are right and actually we're in quite a difficult situation. What might that future look like? How would I position my business? How would I respond today in preparation for that future? That's what futures thinking is. It's about saying the future is uncertain. And because of the uncertainty, what I really need to do is I need to explore all of the possibilities. Well, not all of them, because you'll be here, from now until eternity, but at least a good selection of those possibilities so that at least I'm mentally prepared for the divergence of what the future might look like from where we are now. And in that preparation, I think what it really allows you to do is to develop the kind of mental agility so that you develop a confidence, because what you're saying to yourself is, you know what, even if I haven't thought of the scenario that eventually plays out, I've practiced enough in my mind to actually handle no matter what comes my way. So if the economy goes to shit or if it's brilliant, I'm ready. I've got a little fund over here, which is my nest egg. I've got these selections of products in play, whatever it might be. But at least what you've got is that you've developed and practiced that ability to think clearly and to be agile in your approach as the future unfolds.
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful way of looking at it. And I just want to attach to that for a moment what you said about uncertainty, and how uncertainty feels like something that we're kind of almost like we're sort of flirting with it constantly, even though we hate it and we feel very conflicted about it, and no one likes uncertainty, but it's always around us anyway. It's uncertainty is a certainty in a way, right? It's always going to be there. It's a persistent condition, but being able to kind of give yourself these sorts of models or learning how to think helps us to sort of almost defend against uncertainty. Or maybe a better way to put it is to embrace it, because there's no way to get rid of it, obviously. And so it's about kind of working with it so that you can still, you don't want to get to the point where you're paralyzed by the uncertainty, but rather continue to move forward so that you can still make decisions. You can still act as though you had some sort of certainty. And obviously there's doing it with a level of calculation and a level of process with it as well. Not just like, let's just put everything on red, right? Yeah.
So I think what would be useful is to actually paint that in the opposite way. So let's say, for instance, you were very certain about the future. So, you knew that by the end of the year, interest rates will be down. You just knew. And because of your dogmatic certainty, you then had a very singular view of the future. And you obviously structured your business, you structured your approach to the future based on that singular view of the future. Now, the chances of your perfect picture of what tomorrow might look like, the chances are very good that that will not play out. And when it doesn't play out, you are now surprised. Now you start labeling things a black swan. Like when COVID-19 hit, everyone was like, oh, this is a black swan event. No, it wasn't a black swan event. For decades and decades, there were lots of reports that said a pandemic is imminent. It's coming. It's only a matter of time. Prepare yourselves. But everyone ignored those reports. They were like, well, it came from the UN. It's a bunch of academics that are talking about these things. What do I care? The information was there, but nobody actually considered it as a plausible future scenario. They didn't say, wow, actually, this thing might well happen. I need to structure my business so that when this force of change does happen and they close down economies and we all have to stay at home, what do we then do? Maybe what we need to do is just explore some of the options that would allow us to trade under those conditions. So I think that's the thing, is that the biggest danger is this rigid thinking. And I suppose exactly what you say is that in some aspects, there is quite a lot of certainty around. We know that tomorrow the sun will rise. We know that this year is a leap year. There will be 29 days in February. It's not going to be a surprise. But there are other aspects of life where there's huge amounts of uncertainty. And I guess what you need to be able to do is to critically understand where certainty lies and where certainty doesn't lie. And where certainty doesn't lie, and there's a lot of impact around that uncertainty should various futures play out, that's where you need to start your thinking process. You need to be saying, right, this is a risk, or this is a massive opportunity. Let me think critically about what might happen and actually be quite humble. We've spoken about this before. Let me be humble in my thinking, to not be arrogant and say, oh, I know what's going to happen. You say, you know what, I don't know, but because I don't know, that means I've got these tools at my disposal where I challenge my own thinking and I look at my own biases and I try and make sure that I myself am not surprised by my own narrow-minded thinking. That's what you want to do. You don't want to surprise yourself because, you're going to screw yourself. Don't screw yourself. Think creatively. Think about the future in a better way.
I love all of that, including the humble mind shout out, of course, which is obviously the point of all this. You now see my evil plan, but so just bringing it back sort of to the individual for a moment. What are some of the tools or models, techniques, whatever you want to call it, that maybe you use, or that could be practical for someone to kind of listen to us and go, okay, John, all this makes sense. Great. It's a good ad for thinking clearly. How do I now go about doing that? Or maybe changing one thing that I can look at, and start to put some of this into practice, so that ultimately it can show up in the results, in the way that I might want to run my business, or if I want to lose 10 kilograms, by the end of the year, or whatever that outcome might be. How can I start to sort of put just one thing in place today? Are there certain tools, things that you use to help to break this?
So the first thing I think, which is really useful, which sounds super simple, and it is, but maybe it's only simple if you put a spotlight on it. I think the first step, which is very useful, is having an awareness of thinking, having an awareness that there are different styles of thinking. And when you have a specific idea in your head, or you're wanting to make a decision, in that moment, you can actually say to yourself, now, I have this idea in my head, I have a belief, I have a concept, I have a picture of the future. Where does that come from? What is informing that specific idea or picture in my head? Let me go and investigate. What's going on there? Let me just try and understand. And I find myself doing this all of the time. So a classic example is I'm doing some work with a client where they specifically said, listen, we like the work that you've done with regards to loyalty, exploring customer lifetime value, and how do you improve customer lifetime value? So they said, would you please explore some of those tools, those techniques, that strategy for our business? Which absolutely, I was very happy to do that. And I started exploring that. The more I explored it, the more I realized that my assumption that a simple statement, and the statement is, it's better to retain a customer, it's cheaper and better to retain a customer than it is to go and get a new one. So that's a saying that all marketers use. It's better to retain a customer than to go out and find a new one, because it's cheaper. And it just makes more sense. Once you've got a customer, make sure that you treat them well and they'll come back to your business over and over again. I realized that that was an assumption. I didn't have any proof that that was the case. And even though I was reading some very interesting books on customer lifetime value and loyalty and some very forward-thinking statistics around it, I realized that I needed to just test whether the opposite might actually be true. And when I did go and explore some other thinking, which just so happened to be in a different category, like a different academic discipline, I realized, well, actually, there's quite a lot of evidence from equally clever guys who are saying the exact opposite. So now I'm in a conundrum. I'm like, cool, well, they've asked me to look at loyalty, and actually I'm finding all this other stuff where actually it's much cheaper to go out and just be acquiring customers all the time. And there's proof. And, they've got evidence, and they've done 10-year case studies. Like, wow, well, this is awkward, isn't it? So I guess that's the first point that I'm trying to make, is have an awareness that you are making judgments and basing decisions on assumptions that you have. And if some of those assumptions make you feel uncomfortable because you now have this awareness, go and explore a little bit. Go and just see where it comes from. Go and see whether there are academic papers that prove the opposite. So that's the one side. The next thing that I would kind of say is that, the irony here is that I've got this system 1, system 2, and actually more and more that I think about it, there might actually be a system 3. And system 3, and I'm going to tell Daniel Kahneman about this. Maybe he'll give me a sort of a byline.
A Nobel Prize.
Yeah, on the next one that he wins. But we talk a lot about in modern culture about meditation. So, you must clear your mind, get rid of everything that you have. Stop attaching yourself to your thoughts. Now, my thinking is that this is almost a layer up from systems 2. So if you are consciously thinking and you're trying to solve a problem consciously and you're working your gray matter, I would almost argue that meditation is where you're consciously emptying your mind of all thought, which I think is far harder than actually doing thinking, right? But meditation requires practice. You can't just pitch up and meditate for a couple of hours and go, oh, I'm a guru. You can't do that. You've got to spend a lifetime. People spend a lifetime trying to get good at meditation. Now, I would argue that, if you need to practice meditation, then you certainly need to practice better thinking. You need to improve the quality of your thinking. And this is an interesting point, because I think we just kind of label thinking as thinking. It's not. You get different kinds of quality of thinking. Clear thinking obviously is at the extreme end of the spectrum, where it's thinking that is just critical, and it's, using grounded assumptions and research to come up with really insightful decisions and judgments and all that kind of stuff. So I would say that if you're serious about thinking, if you're serious about improving your competence in the act and skill of thinking, you've got to practice it. And maybe, I think people should learn from your guidance here, Alex. Read books about thinking, explore what it is. Understand that there are various types of thinking. I've got a 3-year-old, and I take her to school. Now, this is like a play school. Right in the entrance hall of their play school, they have Edward de Bono's thinking hats. I'm like, wow, 3-year-olds are going to a school where they're learning about Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats. Now, you think about that. Like, these are children who at that young age are being taught there are different ways of thinking about something. You can think of something positively. You can think about something negatively. You can look at something analytically. You can look at something creatively. You can stop the process and go, whoa, let's stop thinking and come back. Let me guide you back to the problem.
I have never heard of that. I will check that out. I love the idea, though, of almost categorizing thinking in different ways, because often, at least when I think, I'm not sure how anyone else feels, but when I think, or when I think about the word thinking, it's as if I'm using every single thinking facility at once, and you've almost got to keep it back and sort of stop it from just overrunning everything.
Yes.
But when you said, okay, well, now am I going to choose to think creatively? Am I going to pull that dial only? Am I going to choose to think analytically? Okay, only that lever you push forward. And so it's almost like categorizing the ability to think. Otherwise, everything thinks at full tilt. It's almost like using all of the colors on the canvas at the same time, which obviously doesn't look great.
Such a brilliant point, Alex. And that's why I love Edward de Bono's thinking hats, because literally the exercise is that if you're sitting in a group, there'll be 6 people and there'll be 6 different hats of different colors. And one person will get the red hat. And the red hat is you need to think about emotions. So, let's say, for instance, we're making a decision. How might people feel about this decision? How might your customers feel? How might your staff feel about this? How might society feel about this decision and the implementation of that decision into the marketplace? And then that person actually physically has the hat on, and they defend that position. So they defend the emotional state. Or the one person has the yellow hat, which is all about looking at a problem from a positive point of view. So you are now going to, embark on a project. What is the benefit that this project will offer society? What is the benefit that it offers customers? And so on and so on. So the physical act of actually wearing the hat forces you then to hold that position and defend the position. Exactly as you say, rather than jumping between logic and creativity and the billions of biases that are sitting in your head, and you just end up not knowing which way is up. You've actually now forced yourself into a corner where you need to explore specifically from that perspective, which I think is very, very useful.
I want to just for a moment think about decision making, because when you kind of move your thinking to the point where, okay, now we've spent all this time thinking about it, we're looking at options, evaluating outcomes, but now we're going to make a decision. Now we're going to choose an outcome or choose an option, make a judgment about something, and then hope for the best, right? And so I'm interested in maybe exploring this to the point where now we're taking the thinking, which up until now, we're still thinking in our heads. We haven't manifested that yet into the world, where now we're making an option and we're collapsing the wave function, and boom, it's one thing, and now we're going down here, we're going down this path. So a great decision-making process that I picked up from Shane Parrish, who writes that book Clear Thinking, is he thinks that a good process is to define the problem. What are you working on? Explore the possible solutions, evaluate the options of what could be, then you've got to make the judgment. And that's the key part. And after you make the judgment, you then execute. You then go and do that. You go and follow that outcome or that path, or you make that best option. So the decision-making part of it is then choosing the judgment that a certain option that you have available to you is the best one. So that's obviously very rational and very nice on paper, and no one can really argue with that. Okay, cool. Sounds awesome. Let me just apply that, when I have an argument with my wife, or when I'm trying to get my 4-year-old into bed, or, you're not helping me evaluate all the options here, as I sort of shout. But so yeah, I'm just interested. What are your thoughts on that? Would you add anything to that process, or is there a different way to see it?
Yeah, well, I think, you're getting now into strategy. So this is exactly what strategy is. Strategy is not a vision and mission statement. That strategy is not your values. Strategy is not, I would like this thing and here is a set of goals and all of that stuff. The strategy is not KPIs. It's not balanced scorecard. It's none of that stuff. So, let's park all of that. Strategy is about choice. And it is exactly as you've just said, is that when you are in a business and you are presented with options, you've got many, many different options. But strategy works because exactly what you've said is that you've looked at all of the options. You've understood clearly what the real problem is. So I know we glibly say, oh, I understand the problem. Understand the problem, you can spend a very, very long time really getting to the heart of what the problem is. And almost 99% of the time, the thing that you think the problem is not the problem. That's not the problem. You've got to go super deep into what the real problem is. What is the issue that you're facing? What's the real opportunity? And I think that's where strategy becomes very, very hard. Is that people have a strategy workshop and they go, what are we going to do this year? Here's a list of things that we want to achieve, la, 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 la. That's not strategy. You've got to get into the heart of this thing. You've got to make a diagnosis. And the same way that a doctor goes through a checklist of things that, might be, we got to look at the symptoms. Let's look, you've got a fever, a cough. Ooh, there's some weird skin rash. Now I can start to attempt making a diagnosis based on the symptoms that are being presented. So that's the first thing, is that you've got to get into the realm of that. Once you've understood what the problem is, now you need a concentrated, coordinated, coherent response to that specific thing. And this is where strategy comes in, is that you've got to select just one or maybe two things that you've got to do in order to fix the problem. Now, if you're sitting in a big organization, you're having a strategy workshop, you've got HR and marketing, and there's ops, and come on, IT, come on, get in the room.
IT,
Everyone's in the
never there.
room, and they all like, hey, what's my part in the strategy? How is my job or my function going to be affirmed by the strategy? And that's not what strategy is about. It's not about making friends or making sure that someone's job is kept in order. It's about making choice. And it's about selecting that critical leverage point that's going to tip the scale so that you solve this problem. And most importantly, it's about designing a set of action steps that all work coherently with each other in order to focus your energies and your strength specifically on that one thing. That's what strategy is. And getting to that point requires what we've been talking about. It requires critical thinking. It requires, dare I say it, it requires balls. You've got to be super ballsy to say, wow, we've looked at everything, we've identified the problem, and here's our big play. This is the thing that we're going to do which solves it. And that's based on uncertainty. So who's going to be the guy who's going to stand up and go like, oh, this is our solution to this major problem, and it sounds random, but based on our analysis and our critical thinking and our creative thinking, this is what we've decided. That's very, very difficult to do. But is there anything else? If you're a small business, I mean, I can't even tell you. If you're a small business, good luck, because running a small business and getting a small business to be successful is incredibly hard, and it's becoming harder every day. You don't have the luxury of making a mistake, I'm sorry to say, but every single play that you do as a small business or even a medium-sized business has to outperform. You've got to hit home runs every single thing that you do. And the only way that you're going to succeed is to make great decisions. You've got to be brilliant at your decision making based on good judgment. That's what we're talking about.
I mean, I'm a small business owner, and so many people listening are as well. And I think that so much of getting over that initial sort of, I'm trying to think of a better word than terror, but sometimes what it is, you're like, kind of, what do I do? Where do I go? How do I solve this? But I find that sometimes just finding a way to not linger on making decisions is a big help, at least for me, because the more that I don't make a decision or delay something, then it becomes harder and harder to avoid it. It's like when you're sort of avoiding talking to someone, and the longer you don't talk to them, the more you have to end up avoiding them, because it's just going to be such a cluster bomb. So, the velocity of making the decisions, the decision making doesn't matter if they're wrong, but the velocity of it and sort of keeping the consistency up seems to be an important one. Because it's like what Gary Player said, that famous South African golfer, the more I practice, the luckier I get, right? And there's a logic to that, I think. It's not something that you can kind of plot on a graph, but there is a certain knack that you can get to when you're able to be comfortable with making decisions, regardless of what the outcome is. But I can get fitter at doing it. And the fitness is then what over time helps me to maybe make better ones.
Yeah. Look, I think you make a really great point, because I think as an entrepreneur, or if you're running a medium-sized business, you have to make decisions quickly. And that's almost where the work that you've done in your strategic thinking previously allows you to do that. The caveat is, however, that in many ways, small business is largely action-orientated. Understandably, because you have to get stuff shipped, ship it, as Seth Godin says, that's fine. But what if you're busy and you're working and you're doing actions which are completely irrelevant because you haven't gone through the hard yards of doing the thinking first? And that's why you can't have one without the other. They're both really, really important. But the real challenge for entrepreneurs is to make sure that you don't just get into one. And I know that there are people that are good at thinking and they talk and la 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 la, and there's like a lot of babble. And then you get businesses that just ship all the time. They're just producing, and it's very, very busy.
Yeah, the extremes. Yeah.
The trick is doing both. You've got to do both. You can't just be shipping all the time. It's got to be rooted in good, clear thinking. And I've seen that so many times. I've worked with guys who are unbelievably good at getting shit done. But my goodness, if they make a mistake, and they do it repeatedly, they kill the business. They go all in on an idea, and they're optimistic, and they put in they're optimistic. So they produce a lot of stock for something where they are sure that it's going to play out. And then they kill their cash flow. They kill the business. And as many times as I have to say, do the thinking first. Like, before you do all of these things, understand the context, understand where you are, understand your business before you pull the trigger. And that's the challenge. And sometimes I pull my hair out because, I think startups and guys, especially in America, are very action orientated. But action without the thinking is just busy and noise, and it gets you nowhere.
I think we can agree on that for sure. Yeah. There was a great question put in by Rana here, which was, how, when we're identifying the problem, that first step that we talked about in that decision-making process, how can we better identify our own bias that we might bring to the table, or, recognize the blinders of noise? Beautifully said, Rana. The noise that sort of maybe drowns out what you should be locking onto.
Great question. And that's really, really difficult. Well, I guess, again, the first step is recognize that you have bias. Everyone has bias. And even as a practitioner, as a futurist, someone who facilitates sessions with executives, when I am facilitating that session, I need to be aware that I'm bringing my energy into that space. I'm going to be bringing my own biases and my own stuff into stuff which is not mine. And doing that successfully is very, very, very difficult, because you can see that a group are moving in a direction. You're like, no, don't go in that direction, come back here. That's the wrong place. But doing that means that I'm interfering. So in many ways, it's the same if you're analyzing your own thinking. The bias is there. And that's why I think just a simple framework like the thinking hats is useful. Because, again, like, if you're thinking in a very specific way about a problem, it's useful to stop and say, right, this is a very one-dimensional perspective on, what I'm thinking. How might I look at it from different points of view? Let me purposefully stop and just hold the space for myself and look at it differently. How might an analyst look at it? How might an accountant look at it? How might frickin' someone who works at Disney World look at it? I think that in some ways just helps, not necessarily to magically solve the problem, but once again, it forces you into the practice of realizing that you have an entrenched perspective that can be manipulated and shaken up a little bit.
It's a recognizing it and just owning up to it, maybe even, a level of honesty is probably the first most important step, because perhaps then it just unlocks everything else after that.
And it's an uncomfortable process. Like I facilitated a workshop the other day with a group of people, and I actually challenged them to think like Trump supporters. Sorry if there are Trump supporters on the call. But in many ways, I suppose what I was trying to say to them is, think super conservatively about this. How might somebody who's very reliant on, fossil fuel extraction, and their job is reliant on the old way of the world operating, how might they feel about this? Put on the red thinking hat and get into their heads as to how they might feel about it. So don't just steamroll them and think like, oh, well, what do they know? They don't know anything. That's not true. There's a perspective there which is powerful, and I think it's worthwhile in just exploring it from that perspective. You don't have to agree with it. You just need to look at it and just see what happens, see what the outcome is from that process.
I want to just for a moment go back to a word you used earlier, which is a word I've heard you use before, and something that's cropped up on your website and your articles before, which is outperform. And it's something, or outperformance, that
Right.
you've used and a talking point, I think, also amongst your clients as well. Talk to me about what outperform means, and what is the difference between sort of performing and outperforming, and where that kind of threshold is between the two, and perhaps even how clear thinking can help
Right.
you navigate the difference between the two.
All right, so let me lay out my own perspective here, and that perspective is informed by research. My perspective is that if you are running a business and you're happy with just growing that business, you will be out of business very, very quickly, because the world is changing and the competitive environment is dynamic, and we are operating in a global economy where, unfortunately, we are operating on a capitalist system. And a capitalist system rewards the biggest players in a category exponentially. So if you are the market leader in a category, you not only have more customers who buy from you more often, but the reality is that a large percentage of your customer base will churn. They'll go and buy something else. If you're Coke, people buy Pepsi and they buy water and they buy iced tea, and maybe they buy alcohol, instead of Coke. You've got to, if you're the biggest player, you're affected less by that churn, by that sort of lack of loyalty in your group. So if you're a middle of the road business in a category in the marketplace, or you're a small business, you're screwed. The statistics will tell you you are screwed. You just can't. It's very difficult for you to make progress within this system unless you are absolutely dedicated to competing successfully with the larger incumbents in your category. So how do you do that? If you're smaller, you don't have access to the money or the resources or the finance. So you've got to think strategically. You've got to be shrewd. You've got to find opportunity where your strengths play up against the weakness of the bigger players. So, my perspective is that if you are running a business, you really have to have an energy and a hunger to compete. And as an example, later this week, I'm doing a workshop with a company here in South Africa who are very, very successful. And they have been successful for 25 years. In 5 years, they want to exit the business. They want to make sure that what they sell the business for is the most. The valuation needs to be maximized. So how do they do that in 5 years? What might the strategy be in order to do that? So when I started the process of having a discussion with them, it became very clear that they are, for want of a better word, they're happy to just kind of go along the normal growth trajectory. There isn't sort of a hunger to win. There's no hunger to compete. And when I challenged the CEO about their lack of competitive edge, she kind of said, well, it's just not us. We're not competitors. We're happy just to kind of follow the steps that have been successful for us. But the reality is that in a country like South Africa, unless you are a business which is growing exponentially, who are outperforming, you're not going to pay more tax that goes to the social good, hopefully. You're not going to be employing more people, and we desperately need more employment for more people in South Africa. So the reality is that if you are running a business and your intention is not to be the biggest, most powerful, most successful brand in your category, then what are you doing? You're just coasting. And coasting is just not sustainable. You can't do that. You can't have impact, and you're always going to be on the back foot. So when I talk about outperformance, another way of looking at it is that you've got to think big. You've got to be bold. You've got to be confident. You've got to have extreme competence within your category to out-deliver value for customers, for your shareholders, for your staff, for your business. And that is a conscious decision. And that's where strategy comes in. That I think when you have that consciousness of, wow, I'm really keen and I'm energetic and I want to be the best that I can be. I love excellence. I want to build a brand that people go like, oh my goodness, that's one of the best brands in the world. When you've got that, now you can start talking strategy. Now you can say, right, what's going to be our approach? What's going to be our play to capture more of this market and actually sell things that are of value to society, and replace the players that are not producing the value and actually should be kicked out.
I suppose it starts with that strong vision, that strong intentionality of what you want to do, and being pretty dogged about it. Rana's just made a comment there in the comments saying, can you not be the best instead of the biggest? And perhaps she's kind of hopping onto something that makes it seem like in order to outperform in the way that you've just mentioned, you've got to kind of be this, coke sniffing Wall Street corporate raider who's going to come and destroy everything.
So, in many ways, what you can do is you can say, well, the biggest and the best in what category? You can slice a category down and down and down into a very small little segment and say, well, I'm Patagonia, so I'm the best in sustainable outdoor. Yeah, sure. But if you're Patagonia, you can also say, actually, we're competing in clothing and apparel, and we want to be the best in clothing and apparel. Now, imagine if Patagonia had said, right, we want to be number one in clothing and apparel. We want to capture more market share than H&M and Zara and Shein and Temu and all of these fast fashion companies. Imagine if Patagonia had gotten that right. We would all be buying sustainable fashion, or sustainable as we can get it to be. That's, I guess, what my point is that don't think that competing and beating the bigger players is a bad thing. It's not about being money hungry. As I said, we work in a capitalist society. Unfortunately, the rules are very, very clear. I remember many years ago, I worked for a small clothing retailer who at the time took a big shopping center here in Cape Town to court because his argument was that the bigger anchor tenants were getting a better rate on their square meterage rental that they were paying. And he said, that's not fair. We're a small player. We also have customers. We're bringing in trade into the center. Why do we pay proportionally more than the bigger guys? And at the time, I remember saying to him, that's capitalism. Capitalism is that the big shopping centers want the anchor tenants because they bring in the customers, so they give them a better proportional rate. Like, what are you going to do? If you're buying a Super Bowl ad, it costs $7 million for 30 seconds. If you're a small company and you only have a turnover of $50 million a year, that's a huge amount of money. If you're Coca-Cola, it's like, we'll have a couple of those. So that's the reality about capitalism. But the system is rigged. The system is not fair. So even though you don't necessarily want to compete, competition is the game. And I'm not saying that you need to be a greedy capitalist pig. I'm saying you need to have impact. You've got to build a great brand that carries weight, that makes money, because that's what great brands do. They command more profit. They command more margin. They just more impactful. And that's what outperformance is. It's about developing that mindset so that you can have impact. And that's how you build a better world, by replacing the shit options with good options that people want to buy.
I like that. That's a cherry dictum if I've ever heard one. Replace the shit ones with the better ones. I like that.
Right. And make it compelling.
If I was, sitting in the shoes of an entrepreneur or maybe someone who has a position in a business, or, just kind of taking it back for a moment to, healthy thinking clearly, and how it can show up, not only in an everyday basis, but also sort of how we just, once again, taking back to the future as well, back to the future. Is there something that you can kind of recommend, or even if it's a book or a daily practice or a habit, to sort of like help somebody think clearly about the future? Because like we were saying earlier, it's often about this uncertainty, and and when people feel uncertain, they are more risk averse. They're more conservative in a time, especially when we need to be thinking bigger about things. I think people end up kind of a lot of the time thinking smaller because they don't want to lose, they want to protect what they have, and so on, which is a normal instinctive way of doing things. But at the same time, the decisions you need to make, the space you need to fill, the bold action you need to take requires you to really be thinking in a totally different way. So is there something that you help when you're consulting with your clients, when you're speaking with friends, even, like, is there a way to think about the future, not as this big scary monster under your bed, but somehow as something that can be accessible and can be something that can help to unlock itself?
So I suppose the first thing that I would recommend is make sure that you go on something of a media diet. Just like I think I see it in myself. I'm bombarded by information all of the time. And often when I feel overwhelmed, it's because I'm just getting fired information from everywhere, whether it's on your phone or on the news sites that you read. I think there's value in just kind of critically assessing all of the stuff that you're putting in your brain. So first of all, to do that, really do that. I think then you can start to beginning a process of actually then adding in things like sources which might be of use. And what I would strongly recommend is, find things that are out of the ordinary. If you're always reading, the New York Times, just try and get a diverse perspective from different areas. Listen to Al Jazeera now and again. Try and get a perspective from different parts of the world. Add in sort of sources of news which are different. So futurists call this a process of scanning, where you actually gather together like a scanning repertoire, like a portfolio of different sources that really you just casually scan, but make sure that they are of good quality. So you don't, even some of the guys who are professors and they, have distinguished titles at major American Ivy League universities, some of the stuff that they even say, I'm like, geez, really? Do you really believe that? I'm surprised. So I guess that's the first bit, is read widely by yourself. Then I would start sort of adding titles like the book that you were talking about earlier. Read stuff from people like Richard Rumelt, who's one of the godfathers of strategy. Read some of his stuff. Read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, or at least an abridged version of that. Understand how thinking works. Get into that practice. Edward de Bono, who passed away in 2021, read some of his stuff. Look at the books that he's published. Maybe just have a look at the Thinking Hats exercise. My 3-year-old's doing it, so it shouldn't be difficult. But just get hold of some of those books and start exploring that realm.
Great advice.
Yeah, so that's what I recommend. I think there's so much in this space, but that's a good start. Rumelt is a great start. Just read people where their thinking is actually rooted in some kind of research. As much as I like Seth Godin, again, some of the stuff that he writes, it's just like, seriously, what's backing what you think here? So, read the research, get proper information from people who've actually spent time researching things.
I suppose to kind of distill what you're saying is to read a lot, obviously, but also to read wide and to open up, kind of take away the blinders and to sort of, go as wide as you can, while also, like you said, going on somewhat of an information diet as well, the junk food.
Right.
Trying to cut out as much of that as possible too.
Yeah. And understand also it's a lifelong process. So you're not You're not going to read a few books and then all of a sudden become a master at thinking. The same way as that you can't go on a Wim Hof course and become, an expert in meditation. It's a practice. And it's your own journey, it's your own practice. So start there. Start with those things and just explore. And what you'll find is that very quickly you'll add things into that mix, your own stuff. But I guess what I would urge you to do is just read information which is of good quality. Read the old philosophers, or if needs be, follow Alain de Botton, that philosopher from the School of Life, who's also quite level-headed. But I suppose exactly as you say, Alex, it is about just the practice. Start with that, and put it to good use. Put it to work. Six Thinking Hats, the framework, that's the book that you were mentioning, that's very, very useful. Richard Rummel talks about strategy as being the kernel, which is a diagnosis, a guiding principle, and then action steps. And that's a very simple way of doing exactly that. It sounds super easy, but just getting to the grips of a diagnosis of what the problem is can be a
starting point.
time-consuming. But with all of these things, what you've got to do is take the approaches and apply it to your own context. And you'll learn so much just by applying, because you'll realize what works, what doesn't work. That's really the value here.
Beautifully said. Ashley, I want to come to you.
I was just going to go back to your being mentally prepared for the future and looking at all possibilities. This is something I do practice in my daily life with decisions that I have to make, or situations that I am put in, but I often find myself being very anxious because of it. So I'm constantly looking at everything that can go wrong, everything that can go right, how I would be in every situation. And I'm just wondering, what is your advice on maybe mitigating that anxiety and maybe looking at it from a more logical perspective? Because being a woman as well, we're quite emotional, and things can get quite scary. Yeah. So what is your advice then from that perspective?
Ooh, I mean, that's a big one. Look, so two things. I think the one is, what you're speaking about is, yes, you are thinking about the future, and it sounds like you're doing it in somewhat of a critical way. So you're looking at the various, futures that might unfold, which is very, very useful. That's step one. I guess what it sounds like that's happening is that within your systems two thinking approach, there's a lot of system one, anxiety and emotional judgments, judgment based on emotional reaction, which is coming into it. So that's a challenge. If that's happening, what it really tells me is that you're not necessarily in control. And if you're not in control of your mind, as you know, your mind controls you. And it's hell to be controlled by your mind. That's the last place you want to be. There is no worse taskmaster than your monkey mind, running through scenarios. So that's a major problem. And if I'm honest with you, I've also dealt with that. I've spent time in therapy for that. If I'm blatantly honest, because a lot of psychology comes into that. But what I found really, really helps is that, in my life, I've gone through some situations, and I've always figured out a route around those situations. And if I look back at my experience in kind of figuring out a route, sometimes I did a good assessment and I figured out like a good, clear route. Sometimes it was just by chance and I got lucky. But you know what? If I think back, I did okay. It was okay. So what I've really done is I've given myself permission to trust myself. And funny enough, like when you're in that moment, you really need to say to yourself, you can ask yourself a very simple question. And the simple question is, if I trust myself, what would I do in this situation? And it's a big question. It's easy to say, but think about that really carefully. If I trust myself. Now, the word trust is a big one, because trust means that no matter what, you'll be okay. It's quite a brave statement. Because what you're saying is that, geez, you know what? If fucking hell came down here, I've got it because I've done it and I'm smart and I'm shrewd and I thought about a couple of possibilities and I know some people and I'm wiry. I'll figure it out. And I guess that's where you got to get to, is that there's no ways that you can explore every single future, scenario that might play out. At some point, you've just got to trust yourself. You've got to trust your own ability. You've got to trust that the work that you've done in the thinking and all of the experience that you have in life is going to have your back, because you're the only one who's got your back. And what I've found is that if you don't trust yourself, that's when the monkey mind really starts to wind up, because then all your own doubts start talking to you and you start believing it. Just tell them, cool, I hear you, I see you, but I trust me and I got this. So just keep quiet and I'm going to carry on regardless.
What a beautiful answer.
Hopefully that helps. Yeah.
That's perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. Quite inspiring. I feel like I can conquer the world.
Absolutely. John, I didn't anticipate that this conversation would go in so many different wonderful directions, but and yet we did. So I want to thank you for your time and making all of us think a little bit more deeply, a little bit more clearly about what's in front of us and how to also take that into what we're going to be working on in the future. So yeah, I appreciate it. Appreciate taking a walk around your brain.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, it's always fun. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. I know I can go off on a bit of a tangent, but yeah, look, as I say, I think it's such an exciting space to explore. I think we totally undervalue thinking. So I guess just in conclusion, thinking is great. It's a superpower. It's the most empowering thing you can do for yourself. You've got to wrangle the beast because it's there. But I think if you have the competence and the skills to really to have agency over your thinking, that's the best way I can kind of put it. If you've got agency over your thinking, that is an incredible skill that they're teaching 3-year-olds. But I think even as adults, we can teach ourselves that and get into the practice of doing it. So what I'm hoping is that, as much as meditation is great, I would really hope that at some point people actually just assign time in their calendars just to think, sit quietly and think, go into the process of carefully thinking through a problem. And having the agency just to control your style of thinking and what you're thinking. I think that's potentially a new era of thinking, which is coming. Someone needs to write a book about it and I suppose, get it onto YouTube and have a few influencers. And hopefully then we'll all be doing that, because I think it's incredibly empowering for us all.
Absolutely. And I have a good idea who should write that book. So #just saying. Good stuff. Thanks for joining Humble Mind podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Humble Mind. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're curious to take a look at our community, if you're not a member, you're missing out. Make sure you head to humblemind.co to check out more and to see what we're up to. I look forward to seeing you there. Until next time.